So, as a challenge, I figured that I would see just how far I could push the most limited version of Ableton Live, which is Ableton Live Lite. This is the version that comes with MIDI controllers, audio interfaces, software subscriptions like Splice and Lander, and even $10 applications on your phone, things like Koala Sampler and Ableton Note. And here is just a little bit of the track that I came up with. On paper, Ableton Live Lite is incredibly limited. You have access to a maximum of 8 tracks, 2 return tracks, and a very limited pool of audio effects, MIDI effects, instruments, and sounds as well. You can, of course, use third-party plugins and any kind of samples that you want from sample packs, etc. But for this challenge, I wanted to see just how far I could push only what comes with Live Lite. This includes just the samples, sounds, presets that come with this edition, and no third-party anything at all. And so in this video, what I want to do is talk about some of the ways that I overcame these different limitations of Ableton Live Lite to come up with the track that you heard. If you want to listen to the full track before diving into this video, I'll leave a link in the description where you can do just that. Otherwise, let's kick into it. Okay, so let's start with the track limitations. Ableton Live Lite has a total track limit of 8 tracks across both audio and MIDI tracks. This can prove a little bit of a challenge. So what are some ways that I overcame this? Let's take a look at the drums to start with. Here is my drum track for the entire song, and as you can see, all of the drums for this song are just using a single track, and on that track I have a drum rack which has absolutely every single one of the drum sounds I'm using. This includes my kick, snare, all hi-hats, even crash cymbals, some impact sounds, an entire drum break split up across multiple pads, and a whole bunch of other stuff as well. For instance, if I open up this MIDI clip here for the verse, we can see that there's a whole bunch of different MIDI notes going on. These different sounds here are all the different hi-hats. Here is kind of like an effect sound. Here are some crash cymbals. And then here is a cut up drum break. And so this drum break is a drum break that came with Ableton Live Lite. And what I did is actually, for this, I had a new audio track and I took this drum break, did some editing to it, and then split it up and pulled those splits into this drum rack that I had here. And so we can see here on this drum rack, we have all these different drum break slices. And because I wanted to filter and kind of have some effects on just these different drum breaks throughout the verse, what I actually did is collected or grouped all of these different drum breaks to another nested drum rack inside of this drum rack. So if I open up the chain list, we can see here that all these drum breaks are actually inside of another drum rack in this drum rack. Here we have drum rack, and then this is the drum rack inside of that main drum rack, which contains all of those different break samples. And then on this chain inside the main drum rack, I have a saturator, a redux, some filtering, EQ, reverb, and limiting, all of which is affecting those drum break slices and none of the other sounds in the drum rack. And then I've automated these different effects. You can see here I've automated the dry wet of the reverb, and I've automated this high pass and this low pass filter to kind of open up at certain points in the track. I'm gonna save opening up the automation for a second because the automation gets pretty crazy in this session. This second track here, this effects track, is actually what I used for all of my different effects sounds, things like impacts, rises, etc. And all of these are done, again, inside of a single drum rack. You can see here I've got a noise up sweep, which is created using drift. I'll talk about that in a minute. Noise down, same thing, reverse crash, some impact sounds, and some other effects rises. But you might wonder how I actually got these to be the exact length that I wanted them to be. For instance, if we look here at this little break inside the drop here, I have a reverse crash sound that lasts for exactly 2 bars. So a really cool thing that I can do is if we go to the reverse crash sound inside of my drum rack here and scroll over to the simpler, you'll see there's actually an option to warp it as a certain length of bars. So that's exactly what I did. I imported the crash cymbal, I right-clicked it to reverse the sample, and then I just clicked on this little button here, which did say 2 bars, currently it says 1 bar, and then I could be assured that if I put in a 2 bar long MIDI clip, then I would have this particular sound play for exactly 2 bars. This saved me having to have multiple audio tracks, one for each of these different reverse sounds, and I could be sure that each of the reverse sounds were exactly the length that I wanted them to be. Of course, for other reverse sounds, things like this noise up, I actually just created a drift patch and then just had some automation on a low pass filter, high pass filter, and some other effects to create that noise sweep. And now we start to get into some much more complicated ways of overcoming track limitations. First, let's take a look at the bass sounds. So for this song, I actually have a lot of different bass sounds going on. I have one in the verses here. I've got this kind of screechy bass sound, which you can hear in the drops. I have a kind of another rolly bass sound that you can hear in the drop. And I have some kind of growly bass fills. And underneath all of them, I have a sub bass, and all of this is happening on a single track inside of the session. And the way I achieved this is by using instrument racks. So here on this bass track, I have an instrument rack, and you can see this instrument rack has kind of 3 main sections. We have this verse basses, drop basses, and this drop B basses. If I open up the verse basses chain just by double clicking, you can see that we have an instrument rack, and on here I have a rolling bass, a rolling fifth, and a sub. And that's because I've got 3 different sounds that happen in the verse. I have that main rolling bass sound, I have a fifth layered on top of it, and then I also have a sub underneath it. Here's a section where all of these are playing together. And then of course I have the drop basses here, which again has another instrument rack with a whole bunch of different sounds in it. But how did I switch between these verse basses and the different sounds in there and the drop basses and the different sounds in there? Well, I used a lot of automation. So here is the bass track, and let's go ahead and open up the automation mode. And if I scroll down, you can see that this bass track has so many different automation lanes. Now, not all of these are used for changing between different sounds. Most of them are actually used for affecting some of the different sounds for sound design, which I'll talk about in a bit. But there is lots of automation on things like the speaker on for certain chains or the device on for certain chains. And what this allows me to do is automate which sounds I want to be able to be heard at certain points in time and which sounds I don't want to be able to be heard at certain points in time. And by having these 3 main chains, the verse basses, drop B basses, what I can do is automate the speaker on and off for these kind of parent chains. And then I can automate the speaker on and off for the individual chains within inside these parent chains. Let's go to the drop, which is a fairly complicated part. So here at the second drop, as I play this, take a look at what's happening here with all these different speaker on and off automations inside of this drop basses instrument rack. So you'll notice there that the sub is playing the entirety of the time, and then I'm muting certain chains at different points in time to kind of play between the different sounds. Now, as well as automating the speakers of each of these different chains on and off, there's also certain points where I'm automating the actual sound making devices on and off. And the reason for this is that I didn't want to cut off the chain completely, but I also didn't want that sound to make any sound. For instance, on this screech sound, there's a lot of reverb on it, and I wanted that reverb to linger out over the other sounds, but I didn't want that screech sound to make sound by itself, so I've actually automated on and off this drift synth here so that the reverb tail can keep going, but it's not generating any new sound. If you listen closely, you'll be able to hear that screech sound reverb continue out, whilst the actual screech sound itself doesn't play anymore. Next, with the synths, I used some similar tricks of this kind of automating on and off speakers, but I also used the key zone mapping inside of an instrument rack to have different sounds playing at different ranges in the keyboard. And this is particularly noticeable in the second verse. So here on this Synths 2 track, I actually have a few different sounds playing. I have this verse Atmos sound, I have this drop Atmos sound, a rain and train sample, and then this break bass sound. And you can see here that they all cover different ranges of MIDI notes. This break bass is kind of from D1 and below. These Atmos sounds here are from D sharp 1 up to C5, and then this rain and train sound is from C sharp 1 upwards. And what this means is that I can have different MIDI notes here on the exact same MIDI track in the exact same MIDI clip, and these notes here are playing one sound, these notes here are playing another sound, and this note is playing another sound. And so they can all come together and sound like this. Lastly, when it came to overcoming track limitations for vocal layering, I made heavy use of the new auto shift device in Live 12.1, which comes with Ableton Live Lite. So for instance, here are the lead vocals in the kind of post-drop section.
I'll chase the light into the sky. I feel a fire burning inside. I'm gonna rise, break past the lies. There's nothing holding me back tonight.
And as well as just a bunch of processing going on here on the lead vocals, which yes, there's a lot of processing. In order to be able to add harmonies to this lead vocal, because I didn't have enough tracks, I actually went onto this lead vocals processing track here, and you can see this very first effect here is an audio effect rack with 4 different chains. The first chain is just an auto shift device, which is pitching the entire thing up 1 octave. Then I have the dry chain, and then I have a high harmony, which is 2 different auto shift devices, panned left and right, at kind of different shift settings for scale degrees. And then I've done the exact same thing here with a low harmony, panned 1 left, panned 1 right, and just shifted them down here 2 scale degrees, as well as shifted the formants slightly of the left and the right sides to kind of stop any weird phasing issues from happening. And you know, the coolest part about all of this is that I didn't even use all 8 tracks or either of the 2 allocated return tracks. I actually only used 7 audio and or MIDI tracks across the entirety of this session. By the way, if you want to see a more detailed breakdown of this Ableton Live session and even download it for yourself so you can dissect it and break it apart, all you need to do is head on over to my Buy Me a Coffee page and become a member if you aren't already. If you're already a member, just head over there now and you'll be able to find the full breakdown. You'll find a link in the description to check that out. So probably the next most limiting factor of Ableton Live Lite is the sounds. There are not many great sounds that come with this edition of Ableton Live, and you're limited to really only one software instrument, and that is drift. And I made heavy use of drift during this song. So absolutely every single one of the synths in this track is using drift. If I go back to the bass sounds here, we can see in the verse basses, this rolling bass is drift, rolling fifth is drift, sub is drift, drop basses, all of these different drop basses are drift, and even this drop B bass is all drift. So every single sound that you're hearing right now is all drift. Drift is potentially actually one of the most powerful synths in Ableton Live, and that's because it has the ability to do basic kind of analog synthesis, it's got noise, it's got some really good modulation, and it's even got like built-in FM that you can use with different wave shapes, and it's got kind of multiple envelopes, and it's actually super duper powerful. Now, I'm not gonna go in depth in this video on exactly how I designed each and every single one of these sounds. If you'd like me to break apart any of these individual sounds in a future video, please comment down below and let me know. But it's safe to say that particularly for the kind of bass growls in this track, I used a lot of the FM mode inside of drift. So for instance, here if I go to this screech sound, we can take a look at the LFO section here in drift and see that I have the rate set to 1:1, which basically sets the LFO to a ratio of the frequency of the note. Then we can just use the LFO to modulate the pitch or maybe even the filter of our sound. And lo and behold, we have some FM inside of this simple synthesizer. And you can see here that I've changed the LFO shape to a saw wave. We have all these different LFO shapes to choose from. And then of course, when we get a saw wave modulating the frequency of another saw wave, you can get some really cool sounds like this. Now, one of the things I did struggle with quite a lot were the drum sounds, particularly the snare sound. So all of the drum sounds in this track came from either samples that come with Ableton Live Lite or by layering those samples with an instance of drift. The kick I wasn't too unhappy with. For the kick sound, as you can see, I actually used the new drum sampler with Ableton Live 12.1, and I did this because it has the pitch envelope effect, which is a really great way of adding just an extra bit of like an impact to the beginning of the sound. And then I did some processing, which you can see is pretty intense actually now that I look at it, but this was a great way to get that kick sounding just a little bit more punchy through this mix. But then I mentioned the snare sound, which sounds like this. And you can see here that I tried a lot of different snare sounds before ending up using this snare called Snare Alien Spawn as kind of the transient of this sound, which I processed quite heavily. And then I layered this with an instance of drift to kind of add that extra noise on top. Here's that kind of transient sound. And then here's the instance of drift that I used to add that extra noise. And together, we have a fuller sounding snare. Now, I'm still not 100% happy with this, but it was kind of the best that I could come up with given the limited time and the constraints. Now, of course, the only sound that I used in this track that didn't come with Ableton Live Lite were my own vocals, but all those vocals were done just recorded into my laptop microphone and then processed only using effects that come with Ableton Live Lite. I processed these vocals using a lot of different processors, but it all effectively followed the technique that I showed in a recent video of how to process your own vocals, which you can check out with the card above, or I'll leave a link in the description as well. Now, speaking of effects, that was one of the other most limiting factors of just using Ableton Live Lite is the limited pool of effects that come with the software. And particularly, this limitation extends to EQs. There is no kind of multi-band parametric EQ inside of Ableton Live Lite. Instead, we only have access to channel EQ and EQ3, which are, to be honest, quite limiting. But I made heavy use of both of these as well as auto filter for all of my EQ needs. Let me show you. So if we take a look again, some drum sounds as examples, you can see here on this kick, I have an instance of channel EQ and then some processing followed by another instance of channel EQ and a filter. And then later on, we have another filter and some more channel EQ. And then if we take a look at some of the other sounds, we have the snare that we looked at before, which we can see makes heavy use of multiple channel EQs followed by an auto filter to kind of remove some of those low frequencies, and then some even more filtering. And this extends to a lot of other sounds, particularly in the synth basses. For example, we can see here on this screech sound, I have some EQ at the end using channel EQ, some auto filter, even some EQ on the entirety of the basses as a whole. If we look at this main plucky ARP sound here, we can see I've got some auto filtering and some EQ, but it just goes to show that you don't necessarily need hugely fancy EQs to be able to process your audio and mix it all together. Now, of course, as I mentioned, I also made heavy use of automation for a lot of these different effects, like I would normally just creating a track without using all these limitations. And we can see that if I just open up the automation mode and take a bit of a scroll through. So on this drum track, we have lots of different automation on filter frequencies and reverb sends, etc., etc., etc. We can see here on this effect track, we have more automation on filters, lots of automation on different filters here, lots of automation on the bass track, on synths, on effects, filters, distortions, phases, lots of different things here. And of course, on all these main synths and the vocals as well. Lots and lots of automation throughout the entirety of this session to really get that movement and make it sound more full and professional. Auto filter I used a lot for just statically removing low or high frequencies, and then of course using some more dynamic movement on low or high pass filters, or even notch filters in the case of the basses, for instance. And lastly, let's take a look at my very, very simple master chain here on my main track. I just have a simple channel EQ boosting a little bit around 1.5K. Then I have a saturator here in the digital clip mode, which is acting as a hard clipper. And then I'm just using the new limiter for Ableton Live 12.1 in the maximize mode on auto release. And I've just pulled down the threshold, used it in mid-side mode, true peak, and just basically played around with some settings until I got something that I feel like sounded pretty nice. So after all this, is it possible to build a pro sounding track just using Ableton Live Lite? Absolutely. Would I do this challenge again? Probably not. It resulted in a lot of confusion towards the end there where I was adding new sounds and trying to figure out what was automated and what automation lane I was looking at, etc. In terms of the sounds, it was a little bit too limiting, particularly when it came to the drum sounds, although I did get a lot of use out of the drift synthesizer, which I found very, very fun. Of course, life would be a lot easier with more tracks, as I wouldn't have to deal with so much automation, turning on and off speakers and devices, etc. But as you can see, it's absolutely possible to get around those limitations by using racks like instrument racks and drum racks. And of course, I didn't even use any third-party plugins or samples or sounds. So if you just have access to Ableton Live Lite, go and get some free third-party plugins. Things like the Kilohertz Essentials bundle or the Melder Free Effects Suite are fantastic starting options. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of free sample packs out there that you can use to get way better quality sounds than what come stock with Ableton Live Lite. But there you have it. That is how I created a pro sounding track using only Ableton Live Lite. Again, if you want to see a more detailed track breakdown and even download the session for yourself to play around with, you can head over to my Buy Me a Coffee page and become a member. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you all in the next video.